Ms. Dr. Muhammad Abu Hena Mustafa Kamal, Directorate of Primary Education, Ministry of Primary and Mass Education, People's Republic of Bangladesh. I'd also like to invite him up on the stage, who will be summarizing the full discussion at the end of the session. Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome everyone to our parallel session on rethinking assessment, approaches to measuring student progress. My name is Said Ahmed. I am the CEO of a local think tank, Institute of Informatics and Development. At the same time, I also, as a local focal person for Bangladesh for the Network on Education Quality Monitoring in the Asia Pacific, NECMAP, the UNESCO-based network, and I'm also work with the PAL network, the People's Access to Learning Network. With us, we have 4 presenters. We will be talking about the assessment. So the question is, we are rethinking the assessment. So not only the assessment we are as such, so why we are rethinking. So that's also the issue. So the objective of the session would be that we want to understand what are the assessments available, what type of assessments are going on around the world, and how the best practices can be replicated, scaled, and at the same time, what lessons can be learned from the challenges that each assessment is facing. So it's all about, after the session, we want us to have a comprehensive understanding about the major assessment approaches that goes on. So that would be the key focus. Now, we see like different ways we want to assess. So the first question that comes, why we are assessing a student? Are we assessing to see whether we are teaching the kid properly? So which means it's not the assessment of the student, it's the assessment of the system. So based on the student's performance, or are we actually assessing the student as well? Are we trying to improve our system or trying to improve the children, and how we do both instead of just doing one? And we have seen over the years the different methods that has developed. Sometimes it has been classroom setting assessment, sometimes it has been household-based assessment. We have seen people who do the household-based assessment thinks the dropout students or students who are not going to the schools all the time, they will miss out on that. But then again, others think assessment should be done in the classroom. We have also seen whether should it be internally, like we are assessing ourselves, or should it be done externally. But when you say internal and external, it also falls differently. Should the government who is running the education system, can we trust the government to do the assessment? Or should there be a third party to do that? Is there a conflict of interest for the government to do that? Should the teacher, professionals, or the citizens do the assessment? If the teacher do it, they haven't, incentive to understand that student, but at the same time, can you trust the teacher not to, mark his or her performance? Can the professionals do it? When the citizen do it, is there a legitimacy issue there or not? But at the same time, we also see it, the assessment, is it like someone, like I want to be assessed as a certificate issue so that I can tell that, how good I am? Or is it someone coming to us to assess the system? And also, we have also seen there are assessments that national government is taking, it's like totally customized, different national ones, and then there are global initiatives to do it. We have been seeing pen and paper test, we have seen oral test, we have also seen like use of technologies and everything. So based on all this, we would want to know how the 4 speakers that we are here today, they are pioneering like different methods and approaches, and we would like to know from them. So with that, may I introduce very briefly now the 4 speakers that we have. We have Ranajit Bhattacharya. He is the General Manager and Head of Communications at the ASER Center. We have Owen Henkel. He is the Director of Pearson Affordable Learning Fund. We have Vyjayanthi Sankar. She is the founder and CEO, Executive Director of Center for Science and Student Learning. And we also have Michael Stark, Chief Officer, Educators International. So we will also have with us the DG, Dr. MD Abul Hena Mustafa Kamal, the Director General of Director of Primary Education. As an honorable guest, he will also summarize the findings for us at the end of the session. So with that, so the 4 questions that we are trying to understand now for each of you. So you all represent different types of assessments, different methods of assessment. I want to understand for all the guests that we have, what core problems or challenges that your assessment was trying to address. Second, while doing it, how it is different from the other assessments. Third, what are the challenges that you faced doing that? And fourth, how is that scalable in the current context or in a new context? Be it a new country or be it a new system or new era in time, or so how is your assessment model scalable? So those are the 4 things we would want to know. So with that, may I request Ranajit Bhattacharya to go first.
Thank you very much, Saeed, and good morning, everyone. My name is Ranajit. I'm actually filling in for Rukmini, who was supposed to do this session. And those of you who have heard her, many of you have, I'm not a patch on her. So do pardon me if I don't, match up to your expectations. Right, so the way I will do it is, I have 7.5 minutes, so I'll try and finish it as fast as possible. I will tell you a story of our assessment, how did it start, and what has it achieved, and the scale, what Saeed just mentioned, the 4 points. So it'll be in form of a story. So we have been working for more than 2 decades now, and from the very beginning, we sort of have worked with 2 kinds of children: those who are left out and those who are left behind. Those who are left out are visible, you can find them playing and not in the school. But those who are left behind are invisible. I'll come to that a little later. Now, the beginning, of course, for us was with the left outs, as was the trend then, both in terms of policies, both international and national, and the practices. The focus was to bring the out-of-school children into the school system. As I think Shofiq Bhai said in the earlier session, that it sort of halved over a decade and half. So the focus was totally on enrollment, getting the children back into the school, into the school system. The enrollment was the buzzword, and policies were input-centric, which were easier to measure. Classrooms, teachers, that kind of stuff. But after having started with the out-of-school children, we soon realized there was a bigger problem inside the school. Children were not being able to cope up with what was being taught inside the classrooms. And in the initial years, we couldn't quite figure out what was going wrong. It was a challenge to us. Soon enough, we realized reading was a problem, and so was computing basic mathematics. These were the foundational skills, that they had not acquired. So they were not being able to cope up with the challenge, with the teaching, in classroom teaching. So what we did was, this tool, this is in Hindi, but this will tell you how sort of easy or difficult this tool is. The one on the left is the story level, is a standard 2-level text. It's sort of check, this is a grade 1 test, and this is a word analytic. So this actually helped us unravel the mystery of non-reading. Similarly, we had similar tools for mathematics, which was basically 2-digit, single-digit, double-digit numbers, subtraction, and division. So this tool was incredibly useful to administer. It sort of told Teachers found it very easy to administer. It told the teacher instantaneously at what level a child was and what kind of treatment the child needed. It also sort of demystified learning amongst the unlettered parents. And this formed the backbone of our ASER survey for more than 10 years now, which started in 2005. Now, we started ASER survey in 2005 because there was no data on learning outcomes then in India at the national level. So there were a number of decisions that we had to make: what to measure, who to measure, when to measure, where to measure, kind of stuff. So what we finally, and who's the data for? So what we finally decided upon was we would test the 5 to 16-year-old children inside the household, surveyed, tested by the civil society. And I don't really want to repeat what I think many of you have gone through the ASER report, so I'm not going to present any data from ASER. But this sort of tells you the reach and scope of ASER. Practically reach out, this is 2016, we practically reach out to every district in India. And it's a sample survey, 30 villages are samples in each district. So the almost 18,000 70,500 villages were visited by our volunteers. Almost 350,000 households were surveyed, and over 1 million children were surveyed by local volunteers. And the impact has been, we feel, has been substantial. ASER has consistently featured in all important government documents, planning documents, and as well as a document called Economic Survey of India, which is produced each year before the budget by the Ministry of Finance. And even at the international level, the SDG 4.1 clearly sort of, I think we have had Brookings, of course, sort of played a major role in this, and we sort of, they also contributed to it. Learning outcomes are now central to all discussions in elementary education, which wasn't the case earlier. Internationally, this is the impact. This is the scale question that I think should answer, indirectly answer what Saeed mentioned. We are currently, we have a network of citizen-led assessment. It's called the PAL network, headquartered in Nairobi. Currently, there are 14 members. More are likely to join in very soon. And our common sort of goal is to not only collect evidence, but also to act on evidence. So as you can see, it sort of stretches across 3 continents: Asia, Africa, and America. Time to rethink and rework assessment? Yes, I think there's definitely a time has come we need to rethink assessment. For decades, measurement in school systems in India and other developing countries focused on inputs, infrastructure, and provisioning. And the current models of measuring student learning evolved in the context of Western developed countries. But there's a basic difference between the Western developed countries and the developing countries. And I'm sort of, here are some, this is what characterizes a developed country. They have more or less achieved universal enrollment. Child populations and age grade distribution have stabilized over time. All schools are registered in national records. Large number of parents have, anyway. So these are the characteristics of a developed country, and I think the developing countries are very different. So the concluding thought is basically stressing that learning assessment for developing countries need to be relevant to these countries. So are the data. Particularly, it should be different because in terms of indicators, context, and process. The findings should be easy to comprehend by all who matter, like the policymakers, teachers, and parents, and they should be actionable. So it's pointless doing a survey without thinking of what action you're going to have, So it should be, measurement should be actionable. So thank you very much. And Ian sort of mentioned about WDR in the morning, 218. Here's a quote which very much sort of sums up what I just said. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ranajit. Thank you very much. May I now request Vyjayanthi?
Right. So in interest of time, let me start the introduction so that while the presentation is getting set up. So I'm from Center for Science of Student Learning. I have a background of about 2 decades in large-scale assessments in South Asia. So prior to starting Center for Science of Student Learning, I was actually a key member of an organization called Educational Initiators, which is one of the well-known testing organizations based in India. So I was part of the startup team, worked and set up the entire practice for about 12 to 13 years, after which went to US for a Fulbright fellowship, came back and worked on setting up a regional assessment for South Asia, which is a project which I'm currently working on, and then also started the Center for Science of Student Learning. Right. So rethinking assessment approaches to measuring progress. So I'll skip this since I've already mentioned a little bit about CSSL. So at CSSL, we look at 3 things: assessment capacity, research into science of student learning, and open source tools. So we think why it's called science of student learning is this, because I don't think that improving learning is easy. The last 2 decades have shown us that improving learning is not rocket science. It's actually more difficult than rocket science. So that's what we are actually trying to attempt through CSSL. These are some of the partners. I'm just sharing for 2016-17 and the type of reach we have. We work with both non-governmental organizations and largely with governments also in India. Okay, let's look at the problem statement which Said was referring to. What are the 3 top problems that we face, and how does this model address that? The first problem is, as all of us know, our children today are learning poorly. And 40% of standard 4 children can do subtraction. This is actually data from ASER. But more importantly, they are learning by rote. What I mean by rote is, it's to the extent that when we ask a question like 23 into 3, if 84% of children can answer, among the same group which was tested, you ask the same question as what is 3 times 23, less than half of them are able to do. So therefore, the extent of rote is such that you not only rote memorize, but you also memorize only certain patterns of questions, not necessarily really understanding the concept behind it. The second problem is that we face is that our assessment systems are ill-equipped, because most often you would find that in India as well as in South Asia. I also work with about 21 countries, national governments in Eastern and Southern Africa. I find that across all these systems, most of the assessments are focused on how much did you score and how many passed, but not necessarily as what did you learn and how well did you learn. If one does not really understand this, I don't think anything much could be done about improving learning. The third problem, in all across South Asia or even Eastern and Southern Africa, you find that there is no institution that certifies and trains on how do you build these educational measurements or research into science of learning so that you are able to actually go and find the root cause of the problem. While most of the time, assessments would tell you that you didn't score it, but it doesn't tell you what you didn't do well. I'll share a short story here. My daughter, when she was studying in her 10th boards and scored 24 out of 25 for a Hindi test, she was called to the staff room and hauled up for why she did not get that extra 1 mark. And then she called me up and she was crying all over the phone. And I said that, yeah, and the teacher had written, can do better, and you should get this thing. And so I asked her, yeah, teacher is really liking you, she's motivating you, she thinks you can do better, and you should be able to do better. And that I had my daughter shouted back at me and said, you also do not understand. I said, what? I don't understand. She said, first time I prepared with all the things that I knew, and I scored 24 out of 25. Now you're saying I can do better. I will prepare the same way. I may end up with 24, or I may end up with 22 or 23. So if I don't have information as to where my mistake is, where I'm going wrong, what I should do well, how would you expect me to get there? Right? So that is what I mean by actually preparing educational measurements which pinpoints not only for the child, but for the teacher and the system where exactly the problem is. So do all assessments result in improving learning? For example, ASER, 10 years they have been doing. Year on year, everybody is eager to see the results coming out. But year on year, Rukmini and our team comes out and say, children not learning, children not learning, children not learning. Second is national assessments. Now, in fact, on November 13th, India for the first time is actually testing National Achievement Survey in every district. We have 702 plus districts. In every district, India is going to test. But then most of these assessments are seen as collection of data for up. It doesn't go back to the classroom. Third is that classroom tests are supposed to be the best ones to improve learning because it's closer to the teacher. But look at this question. So that is a teacher-made question. Balance the Seesaw. This was asked in a class 6 science question. And these were the answers that were given by the students. So if you can actually see here, what the children have been doing is 1 is 1, 2 is equal to 2, 3 is equal to 3. But this is a science question which is checking on simple machines. Rather, but the child is using math ability to answer a science question, right? But if you look at this, if I frame the question like this, instead of the previous way, so there is no way the child can use math ability. He has to use science ability. Sit closer to the fulcrum, you know, that sort of a thing. Load into load arm is equal to effort into effort arm, sort of a thing. So every question has to actually check what it is supposed to check in order to say that the child has actually got it. So I think assessments have to go below the surface because most of the issues are below. And that is what you need to do to uncover the big issues. So then how do you do it? You design for diagnosis rather than monitoring. Unlike a weighing scale, a blood test also takes 1 drop of blood, but it is able to tell everything, right from you, your ancestors, your genotype, your DNA, your RBCs, your whole blood count, your cholesterol, and so on and so forth. So like that, so if you have to design for diagnosis rather than monitoring, then you would pay attention to the test and the item design. So wrong answer is more important than the right answer. Because only if you know what wrong answers are being said and why they are being said, you can address it. And so what we actually do, so how do you, I'll show you one example here. Right, so for example, if you see most of the time, you will have in the test papers, what is the reduced form of 2 by 8? This is a very common question. Children will cut and you will see teachers training them to say 1 by 4, you know. Whereas the same question on fraction is asked in a different way, right? So if you have to design for diagnosis rather than monitoring, you pay attention to the question design, right? So I'll give one more example. For example, let us say the assessment also has to detect patterns of learning. Just like I told you, 23 into 3, and what is 23 times 3? You can see the performance difference. 7 tens plus 3 ones. 63% could answer it. The same thing if you ask 3 ones plus 7 tens. For the same children, you will find that the performance goes down. So like that, your assessment actually has to figure out where exactly the problem is. And also address what we call as the misconceptions. So this is a very common problem you will find across South Asia. Children often would be, you know, when confronted with a question on measurement, would be measuring and giving an answer where, for example, in the first question, most of the children are answering 9 centimeters, whereas the actual answer is 7 centimeters. So this is something which I have tested across South Asia in all types of schools, the elite private schools, the public schools, the government schools, etc. Often you'll find that 20% of children only get it right. So then when confronted with it, most of our learning specialists are saying that children are doing that because they're missing the starting point. So if they miss the starting point, probably then your answer should be 7 centimeter. Instead of 9 centimeter, 9 centimeter will be your answer if you are missing the starting point. But we often found that here, 23% of children are also using 8 centimeter, right? So what actually is happening is that then we put up the question in the classroom and go and question how are you answering it. And then you'll actually find that children were counting the lines 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? Those lines as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and not the distance between the points. So the point I'm trying to make here is that your assessment, therefore, unless it is going to address what I call as the details of the type of learning, you would find that you will not be really able to do much about improving learning, right? The other 2 questions I'll answer during your panel, right?
Thank you very much. Thank you. can I get to when to just very quickly go over all the questions, and also request all the members to keep focus on the 4 questions that we were initially setting.
Yeah, I'll just start while they're setting up the presentation. My name is Owen Henkel. I'm a director of ethics and research at Pearson Affordable Learning Fund. We're an impact investing fund that's part of Pearson. We invest in education startups in developing countries that we believe are doing innovative things in education or increasing access to quality education. I think something I really love about my job is I get to wear 3 hats. One, I'm kind of taking an investor or funder perspective, and so when I think about assessment, I'm thinking like, what does the portfolio company need to show us for us to believe they're doing a good job? However, I also get to work quite closely with portfolio companies, and so sometimes I'm lucky enough to kind of go spend a week with them and really get in the weeds about what kind of measurement they're thinking about. And one reflection I've had is that the type of analysis that a school chain or even a classroom does is very different than the high-level view that a government or a funder wants to look at. There's a level of simplicity that we need to understand that makes it fundamentally not very useful if you're a teacher in the classroom. And then the third hat is kind of doing independent research. And the example I'm going to speak about today is a little bit of blend of all 3 of those. It's one of our portfolio companies called Avanti Learning Centers. They're based all over India, and they prepare students for the JEE. Most of you are probably familiar with that, but for those of you who are not, it's an elite entrance exam for their top-notch engineering schools. It's hyper-competitive. And they kind of do it in a low-cost way and in rural areas where there's usually not coaching services. So in this case, the JEE, you have this very, let me actually go back and give you a little bit more context here. In a sense, these students are prepping for a couple of years in order to gain entrance to college, and the way they gain entrance to these engineering colleges is scoring a certain level on this examination. So you have this sense where their end outcome is already aligned with their practice. Their goal is scoring a certain level on the assessment. So this actually makes certain questions that in a more authentic learning environment might be troubling, like overfitting to the test. That's not an issue here because what you're trying to do is achieve well on the test. They write excellent curriculum, but for a long time they didn't have a very good idea of being able to predict what students would be doing. Obviously, the very best students, they said, oh, they'll do pretty well, but aside from that, they didn't have much visibility. And so some of the research I do into assessment, and it's a little bit more theoretical, but there's kind of 3 things that I like to think about. And one is that we should really start thinking probabilistically about assessment in terms of this assessment will help us estimate how likely someone is to do something in the future or how likely they are to be able to do something, rather than saying like they have this quantity of knowledge. So thinking probabilistically. The second is making use of more diverse data sets. I used to teach, and I can say there's all kinds of really important data in a classroom that would be useful that doesn't really get captured. Stuff like students' posture, as basic as attendance, all kinds of other things that if you had a way to kind of aggregate that and analyze it, I'm pretty sure would teach you a lot more about where students are at. And the third idea is really thinking of assessment as a dynamic and ongoing process rather than a static shot in time. So I was working with Avanti, one of their lead employees and also a fellow on this project, but we started trying to think about, let's take these 3 principles, thinking probabilistically, bring in extra data sources, into the process of their assessment. So the first thing is we went and analyzed their internal tests, which are kind of mock tests that are set off for the JE, and did a very simple correlation analysis. So it's like, okay, how intercorrelated are the tests with one another and final performance? That diagonal line in the center shows that tests are perfectly correlated with one another, which makes sense. You have the same tests on the y and the x-axis. And see, when you see darker blue, there's a higher correlation. So if you look, it's a little right below the center mark, you'd have test 5 and test 4. And that means there's not that much variation between test 5 and test 4, which means they're pretty well-written tests, right? If you see a lot of variation between the tests on student scores, you say there's something wrong with how we design those tests. So the second step is we started tracking students' interquartile movement between their tracking tests and their JEE score. So we said, okay, let's look at someone who scored in the top quartile of all our students on the final JEE, and let's track if they moved around on our progress tests. Again, if these are well-constructed assessments, you wouldn't want to see too much movement. In this, as you can see, which is consistent with lots of other educational research, there's very little movement between the top quartile and the bottom quartile, and most of the movements of students is in between the second and the third quartile. which again you'd actually expect, just kind of normal variation with students. So this gave us a sense there were a few tests we weren't too excited about, we need to revisit, but a lot of our tests were kind of on track. Now this is at the student level. So this is taking the subset of students who passed the JEE, so who had this successful result, and then mapping what quartile they fell in on each of those intermediate tests. And so as you can see, this one individual in the red right there, it seems like maybe they had a pretty rough week or something for that final test. But that orange color up top, you can see they were a top performer all along. Now, this wasn't just to analyze the test. It is like, our goal is how can this be useful for students and for teachers? And so what we're putting this into is a student dashboard. This is still in draft form. But in the top, you can kind of see that based on a MT, which is their master test, it's a mock test, what would their predicted score be on the final JEE, right? Just based on historical performance. So that's that top route. So you can tell a student, hey, your score was, in this case, the first one, MT1 was 180. That means we'd predict with a margin of error that on the JEE, you'd probably be scoring a 100, which is not really cutting it. On the same way, you can look at subject-wise. So the dotted bar is the expected performance of a JEE passer, whereas the colored bar is the performance of that individual student. And then finally on the right, you can show the subject-by-subject performance. Now, in this case, unfortunately, this student wasn't doing too well. But I think what's exciting about it is what can you do with this? So there's two things here. Because the JEE is so intensely competitive, it's actually not good for every student to spend 2 years prepping for this. There's lots of other great pathways. Maybe engineering's not for you. Maybe there's some other pathway. If you spend 2 years prepping for this test, when you're here, you're going to throw in all that time and money when you could have been spending on something else that's a better fit for you. For the students a little bit closer, this actually lets you know what you need to work on. So as you can see here, they really seem to be struggling with physics on the upper right-hand corner, whereas their chemistry seems to be a little bit stronger, right? And you can even dive deeper eventually, but then if you're the teacher or the student, you can say to them, hey, we should actually go review chapter 1 physics, because it looks like you had a pretty, you were struggling with that. And so I think that this is the final piece of this, right, is if you think probabilistically, if you break these things out, it's only useful if you can ultimately break it out and show it to the learner and the teacher so you can actually do something and make decisions with this information.
Thanks a lot, Owen. Our final presenter, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Shubho Shakal. This I can say after 24 hours in this country, and it's about all I can say, so please don't ask me any difficult questions in Bangla. Please don't ask me any difficult questions in Bangla. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to come last on this panel because it allows me to say how much I agree with almost everything which I've heard, particularly perhaps some of the things that Vyjayanthi was saying, and she has 20 years experience in the subcontinent, and I have none, but I do have 30 years experience of it in the UK and elsewhere. And I live and I breathe and I believe deeply in assessment. I frankly believe that assessment is more important than teaching. Significantly so. You could be a wonderful teacher, apparently delivering your lecture in front of your class every day, and it would be worthless because you would have no idea what is the variation in performance within your class. The things which some have got, you didn't even know that they'd got it, and others got nothing at all, and you were not aware of that. So classroom assessment, longitudinal, regular, low cost, and low stakes is what I'm really here to talk to you about. High stakes can come anyway. It will come because governments will insist on that. But we have had far too much of the balance towards assessment for accountability and practically no emphasis on assessment for progress. Who can lead progress? The child, the teacher, the parent. If we had actually two opinions, either that we could demystify learning or that assessing learning is more complex than rocket science. We've got to find the place between those where there is some bit of assessment that even these practical people in the middle of the process can truly understand. And that, I hope, is what I can bring to you today, something which is wholly innovative and has been taken to scale in Africa, not in your continent yet, but maybe, and it works from the teacher's own mobile phone. Now that is a great advantage. We were talking earlier about leapfrogging. Leapfrogging from a mobile phone is probably the most practical way forward. So we have developed an assessment methodology which allows you to carry out the intervention and the assessment and the reporting all from the same mobile phone. And if it works well, this form of assessment can serve both of those purposes. Assessment for accountability, for the benefit of the minister, the system, the owner of the chain of schools, the head teacher who employs this one teacher, and also for the progress of the child. And it works from a very simple, free app, which I will give you the URL of afterwards because we are selling nothing, we're giving it away. So we will not make it work for you on screen, but I can show it to you as many as you wish afterwards. The system works because it is randomized. As a result of being randomized, it can't be gamed. It can't be, the teacher cannot teach to the test, the children cannot copy from one another. You get an accurate and fine-grained measure of whatever it is that you're attempting to do. Our work is mainly in language and in numeracy, and it's mainly in the primary area. And what is magical about this is that you think you're only carrying out assessment, but actually you're carrying out dramatic improvements in learning. And if I tell you that from the absurdly low base of roughly 2% of children in Ghana who are able to read at P2 level in a fluent, independent, comprehending, self-standing way, we were able to multiply that figure 8-fold within a single year with no increase in teaching staff or time on task. Now, you might find that incredible, but later I will explain to you how it's done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. We couldn't have the presentations, but it's kind of like through the mobile phone, you can actually assess the student with, it shows different questions, and it's like, you have a baseline, midline, and end line to see the progress of the students kind of thing. Exactly. Now, we'll have like only 15 minutes or less, so we'll very quickly go to the audience for questions. Anyone? So can we have a mic there? Please introduce yourself and ask the questions as briefly as possible. You may also wish to mention the panelist you are addressing.
Hello everyone. This is Sharmin Akhtar, working as a lecturer of mathematics in the Department of Mathematics and Natural Sciences of BRAC University. And actually I was eagerly waiting for this session, and of course this session was wonderful. And I'd like to draw some attention from the lecture of Mr. Ranajit Bhattacharya, and from your lecture we just figure out a problem that most of the students are dropping out from the school after getting afraid of math courses. And you also tried to figure out more other problems on it, but I didn't find any clear solution of it. And from the lecture of Mrs. Vyjayanthi Sankar, and we find some solution how to improve this situation. Before going to ask you a question, I just want to emphasize on two things. First of all, I think we should improve our perspective, because when we study the math to engineering student, we know how the horrible situation we face when we just try to math. Yes, let me finish.
So because we're running out of time.
And
so
first of all, and I also think that we should recruit more efficient teachers in the primary level. And my question to Ms. Vyjayanthi Sankar is that, is it it possible to deliver the video lecturing to a student from that math teachers who are really interested to teach the children who just live in the remote areas? Is it possible to improve the situation?
Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you.
Over there, can we just very quickly just go for the question only?
I'm Limia Dewan from BRAC Education Program. I just want to draw attention that, first of all the presentation was very good, and assessment system is very nice, very scientific. But here I found, because I'm working with children with disabilities and working with children with ethnic minorities and mainstream their education. I want to ask you, do you have any assessment tool to considering for these type of children? Because you are specific mention about the student. Who are the student? Is the student including children with disabilities and and children with ethnic minorities? Because they have the children with ethnic minorities have a problem with the language. So first they have to understand the language,
Okay.
and then
So any specific assessment for the special need and the minorities?
yeah. And
Thank you.
do you yes?
Can
this
we
is the
get
main
another-
thing? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
My one question is that basically in Bangladesh there is a lot of assessment, JSC, PSC, HSC, and HSC. So a lot of assessment, and a lot of children are getting the very good results, golden A+ and A+. But when they are going to the university, their result is not very much attractive, and they are not doing very much good in assessment test in university, as because the last year or in this year, the University of Dhaka says that only the 14% children are getting the pass mark. But in general, there are 16% children are God-gifted children.
Right, so the question is?
Now, my question is that, very direct question is that, is it the gap between the standard of the assessment, or it is really the gap between the knowledge and skill attaining the children through our education system?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We'll get one last question. Can we come over here?
Thank you. I'm Manzoor Ahmed from BRAC University Institute of Education. I think what all of you have been saying, that there has been different kinds of assessment. I think assessment of learning, for learning, as learning, and so on. And we have had a lot of these. In Bangladesh, we talk about so many public examinations, which seems to be having counterproductive results. So the question is, we know children are not learning. Do we need to find out more about children not learning? How do we do something about what happens? And so, I don't mean assessment is not necessary, but how we relate every kind of assessment that we do to some concrete action and results. And that's where I think there is a big gap. So how do we overcome that? I think that's the question.
Okay, thank you. So we'll start the answer first. Vyjayanthi, you want to go first?
I'll start with the last question because it's more closer to the memory, right? Yeah, so the way we have been looking at is that I think it's not, whether you do board exams or you do any exams, all are exams, right? But the issue is that if you have to do 5 good things when you do any assessment. First is that pay attention to the item design. The questions has to go deeper to get you more information than just passing or the child knows or does not know. Second is that how you administer and collect the data. And third, more importantly, suppose if I'm a teacher and a good teacher and you are a principal and you call me and say that you go and improve the class and I want all of them to score well, I'm a good teacher already. So, but when I go to the class, I would use what I call as the brute force approach. I'll teach the same way in maybe more portions, maybe more time, more assignments, etc. But I need to have information. For example, if my children are not doing fractions, let us say out of the test I've identified fraction is the weak area. Even that doesn't help. You have to go deeper. In fractions, I need to know that my children know fractions means parts of a whole, but they don't know that all the parts have to be equal. Unless I have that type of granular information, I as a teacher will not be able to design any proper intervention to improve learning in the class. So that is the second point. So paying attention to item design and drawing information in a way that is making meaning not only to the policy maker, but also to the class teacher. So at the policy level, what we do is that when I test all of, like, the assessments that CSSL does are very, very large scale. For example, if you take the state of Andhra Pradesh, every single child in Andhra Pradesh tested. Every single child in Rajasthan tested. So in that sense, what we do is that then we collect those and then actually bucket them into 4 different groups of ability. The lower quartile, the middle quartile, and so on. And that the child in the middle quartile obviously knows something more than the child in the lower quartile. We go to find out then what is it that the child in the middle quartile knows. And then we are able to help the system. So we go to the policy maker and say that this is the type of demographic profile you have. This is the type of groups you have. And each group knows this much more. And this group knows this much more. And therefore, if you want to address this, this is where you need to do your teacher training and so on. That's how we address it.
Michael, you want to answer the question about the particularly, if you have a special need children, does your system can address that?
Absolutely. In my opinion, we do far too much assessment in writing. Children have difficulty with writing, whatever their language of origin. If you can do the assessment orally, then you get a much more immediate feedback to the teacher and a much greater likelihood that this will be acted on. And of course the teacher has the benefit of probably speaking the language, or at least some of the language, of all of the children in their class. Whereas the exam is designed for the entire nation and is probably in a single language in most cases. So do your assessment orally. And to answer the gentleman from BRAC's question about why do we keep on assessing but we don't actually improve anything from this, the answer is that if you do it from a teacher-led point of view, you do change it. You create a virtuous circle in which the growing knowledge of the teacher translates into action the very next day in the classroom, and then another assessment, and then more intervention, and then spiraling upwards. That is exactly what we have found.
Thank you very much. Can I get to Owen first? And then I'll ask the action question to come back to you. So because you are doing the assessment for like a bit upper grade students, so the national assessments that we have, sometimes it shows that you have higher standards, that they pass with flying colors, but they're not getting into the next assessment process. So where is the gap? So that was the question from that the very corner. So do you want to, so you have the national assessment that you have, the students are passing with flying colors there, but when they're getting into the job or trying to get into the university, they're failing there. So you have assessment that goes in between. So what's your experience there?
I mean, I think that to that direct question, it's probably a mismatch between the rigor of the exam that the student's passing and whatever the employer is looking for, or the higher level. It could also be just the subject matter. So it's very easy to kind of test folks on certain subject material that they're not going to be asked to do later, is I guess the more direct question. Just quickly, I want 3 bullets to the point about like how can we actually make assessments useful. We should stop thinking in terms of % of questions answered correctly. It's fundamentally not helpful. We should be thinking about, when we think about the norm or criterion reference, so like they should score 8 out of 11 because we know that the questions are this difficult, and that will tell you something about what the students know. The second is that we shouldn't be thinking in terms of test level scores. We should be thinking about item level scores. This things like you need to know what that question is trying to answer. And so if you just say the student got 8 out of 10, me as a teacher, I'm like, that's totally useless. I want to know what questions I didn't get right so I can go back and try to reteach that concept. And the third is we should really stop thinking in terms of average scores of a classroom and look at distributions. So just to recap, really simple, don't think about % correct, think about norms or criterion. Don't think about the test level, think about the item or the question level, and don't think about average scores, think about distributions.
Last question, Ranajit, how you take the assessment to action, just 1 minute.
Half a second. I think Michael and I were speaking about the same thing, and I think the same language, maybe slightly differently sort of expressed. So this is to answer your question quickly. If you notice that I mentioned evidence-based action. Action is the key word here. And we're talking about foundational skills. We're not talking about higher level, grade level skills, you know. Just foundational skills beyond which, without which a child will not progress through any school system. So we have these are this is the action I was talking about. It's called teaching at right levels. You'll find some of these brochures outside. This is directly related to the assessment. So if you want to know more about it, this sort of, you can pick it up from outside. So that's about it. So basically, evidence has to be sort of actioned. That's it. And these are foundational skills.
Okay, so with that, we have learned a lot of assessments. We wanted to try to understand what are the complementarities about the assessments. They are not competing. And more importantly, through the learning sharing of each assessments, how they can actually lead to action, not just, so learning. With that, may I request our guest of honor, Dr. MD Abu Hena Mustafa Kamal, he's the DG of Directorate of Primary Education, to, in 5 minutes, just summarize what you just experienced. Thank you.
I would like to go to the podium. Distinguished gathering, respected panelists, it's my proud privilege to be here. Initially, I was assigned for 10 minutes to summarize the whole discussions, but now I've been told that it should be 5 minutes. So you made my job more difficult now. The four panelists, Mr. Ranjeet Bhattacharya, Madam Sankar, Mr. Henkel, and Mr. Michael Stark. I so far found all of them are very scholar, and very precisely they have presented their areas of ideas. It is really difficult for me to summarize within 5 minutes the whole things, as because my understanding was so poor, but I tried my level best. You might have noticed that I was trying to note all the things so far I can. At the outset, I would like to focus on Mr. Ranjeet Bhattacharya, who actually working as General Manager and Head of Communications, ASER Center. He's focused on assessment that included actually mainly on left out and left behind student. I'm really happy to notice these things with a very high focus. We always straightforward. We try to understand how we can forward looking, but he addressed areas where we need to focus more. Those who are left behind, those who are invisible. He asked a question in his presentation, did schooling mean learning? It's a $1 million question. I guess the audience were trying to understand this question. He focused on some challenges that included reading inability, weakness in math, early grade reading, measuring learning outcomes. As he was quoting the scenario of, I think, India, our scenario is quite similar. And it was not difficult for us to understand the scenario. That's why he emphasized to have scope and scale in depth practical assessment. He was trying to focus on SDG target 4.1, which includes learning outcomes. However, I found his presentation was quite precise and with lots of insights. That was quite informative with the objectives of this session. The second was from Madam Vyjayanthi Sankar, who is the founder and executive director at Center of Science and Student Learning. The nomenclature of his organization is really very, very enthusiastic. That includes the focus of their aim and objectives. We learned from her the learning by rote. Answers are different by different student on similar question. If we analyze this thing, we will find some crude reality at the ground level. Those are our student facing. He raised a question with his presentation, how a student learning what they are learning. He has shown a psychometric diagram in demand and also focused on assessment areas. Since India is a vast country, that might include 31 state board, 3 central board, and more than 100 centers for entrance examination at the tertiary level. However, so far I guessed from her presentation that it is very important to concentrate to know the spirit and message of learning outcomes, rather the learning strategy or learning platform. Mr. Owen Henkel, Director, Pearson Affordable Learning Fund, who is also Director for Efficacy and Research. His presentation was quite concentrated with the realistic holistic assessment. He focused on diversity of assessment and emphasized that assessment should be dynamic. We guessed from his presentation that there are few cross-cutting issues in the assessment areas. He emphasized on interquartile student movement. We saw a very meaningful dashboard where a detailed area of test scores were included. I was trying to understand the difference of understanding of the students that varies country to country, culture to culture. As I have been in New Zealand a few months back and had the opportunity to visit a school in the remote areas, where I saw the students of class grade 7, they were taught regarding climate change issues. I thought the teacher was quite smart enough. That's why he was trying to show us their level of understanding. But when I could come across to the student and ask a student regarding his perception regarding climate change issues, I was simply amazed by his level of understanding. As because at our level, at our age, at our stage, the level of understanding regarding climate issue realistically much behind than that of student. So, basing on the socio-cultural environment, it always varies. If you see the student of grade 7 in our country, you would not be able to see that much level of understanding. The last presenter was Mr. Stark. He emphasized on demystifying learning, also focused on assessment that should be longitudinal, regular, and low cost. There is no denial on that. He focused assessment should be very precise and objective that ensure accountability for the policymakers, teachers, as well as students. Assessment should be randomized, that he categorically mentioned, so that a student cannot replicate it. However, I might cross the limit of my time, so let me finish with few words. My perception goes like that: there is a vast and diversified definition regarding assessment globally, but there is a golden thread among all definitions. That might be assessment is a systematic collection and analysis of information to improve student learning. In our country, eventually and uniquely, you have got a very vast primary education system that includes around 22.17 million students. That includes around 126,000 schools and centers, more than 600,000 teachers. So you can easily assume how vast the primary education system in Bangladesh. So it is very difficult for us to follow the international standard but we are trying. We have got National Student Assessment. Since 2006, we are doing regularly, each and every 2 years. And there is a big question from the citizen of our country, the result of National Student Assessment and the terminal evaluation of grade 5 is not going similar. However, these sorts of gathering, these sorts of platform would pave the way of rethinking. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kamal, for very precisely summarizing the points. So with that, it concludes our session. So we kind of got the feelings that, we need assessments, but probably at the same time, we also need the assessment of the assessments as well to see whether, we are going forward. Thank you very much. And look forward to you on the next sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists to present very rigorous assessment tools and methods they are using to measure student learning. The right kind of assessment is surely the most critical aspect to ensure quality education for the students. And it was very nicely briefed by them how we should go forward, look forward to that. And I'd also like to thank our guest of honor for this session, Dr. Muhammad Abu Hena Mustafa Kamal, Director General, Directorate of Primary Education, Ministry of Primary and Mass Education, People's Republic of Bangladesh. This was a very exciting panel, and thank you all for joining us.